Together, these four strategies hold promise not only to accelerate the trend of reductions in juvenile incarceration, but to stimulate overall system improvement for decades to come. We should not be afraid of this pathway. Indeed, we ought to embrace it. Our country's reliance on juvenile confinement is unique in the world. Even if we reduce juvenile incarceration from today's levels by 50%, which is our stated goal for the next decade, we would still be locking up kids in the United States at rates far in excess of countries with similar political and economic systems. That is, halving our juvenile incarceration rate in the next decade is eminently doable, at least as illustrated by the international experience. But it will require us to make at least 6 fundamental changes in the system as we know it. The first is simply to restrict eligibility for confinement. We need to establish that juvenile institutions are reserved for kids who pose the greatest public safety risk, not the kids who piss us off. One obvious way to do this is to change laws that now allow commitment to the state of just about any adjudicated youth. Second, the financial arrangements which currently encourage unnecessary commitments because the state pays the full freight for those youth must be altered to disincentivize the use of confinement. If there's no cost consequence for uncontrolled reliance on commitments and placements, there will continue to be unnecessary and inappropriate use of those facilities. Third, we need to establish a much more robust and a much more effective array of community-based and evidence-based interventions that can hold adjudicated youth accountable without requiring their separation from their families and communities. And of course, it would make sense to incentivize the use of those alternatives at the same time that we disincentivize the use of secure confinement. Fourth, as I've mentioned multiple times this morning, we need to implement best practices up and down the case processing continuum. After 40 years in the business of alternatives to incarceration, let me assure you that appending alternatives to incarceration programs, even really good ones, to systems that make bad decisions in untimely ways with the wrong underlying values will not serve to reduce incarceration. We need to change how we make decisions, which kids we bring into the system, what we do with them when they get there, how they're represented, and the like. If we can do all those things, then the small number of kids that we get to at disposition will be much easier to figure out what to do with. Fifth, for that small number of kids who genuinely pose substantial public safety risks or whose offenses are so egregious as to demand confinement, we need to establish facilities like those that our colleagues in Missouri have established. Small, well-staffed, regionally based, therapeutic in orientation, places that are humane and rehabilitative. The era of the large training school or youth correction center, a model which has repeatedly failed, needs to end. Finally, our system needs to become accountable for results and for results that really matter. Large numbers of states are still unaccountable or unable to account for their recidivism rates, for racial disparities in their system, for conditions of confinement failures, much less for results that track youth well-being. This has got to change. We know that when things are measured accurately and often, we do better. Hopefully, the movement to reduce unnecessary and inappropriate confinement will strengthen our commitment to timely, accurate data and to its effective utilization. I believe that if we can accomplish these 6 major policy changes, that we'll be well along to a juvenile justice system that can indeed pass the My Child test. However, especially in a system like juvenile justice, where we tend to rely persistently on euphemisms and tend to embrace the same general concepts while operating radically differently, those 6 changes must be guided by a set of values and principles that together give meaning to the My Child test. What are those values and principles? I'm hoping that over the next few years we will actively debate and discuss them. But in the few moments that I have left, I want to share what I consider to be the beliefs most critical to a system for my kids. First of all, I want a system that gets it, that kids are not simply small adults, but largely different creatures, still maturing, less culpable, more amenable to change. Such a system, I would point out, would be loath to prosecute children as adults, to incarcerate kids with adults, and certainly not to sentence them to life without parole, regardless of what they've done. I want a system that acts upon the belief that youth need families, not facilities. A system that understands that whenever we disrupt a family by removing a child, we lessen the odds that that youth will succeed as an adult. On the practice level, this means a system that recognizes the strengths inherent in all families and that devotes its resources to strengthening families. A system that learns from families and involves them in day-to-day operational decisions regarding their children, the same way that you would all insist that you be involved if it was your kid who was being talked about, and also that includes those families in the policy and resource debates that are ongoing. I want a family-focused system. I want a juvenile justice system in which all children, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, or their sexual orientation, are treated equally without prejudice, but with the competencies that recognize these differences and their implications for system policy and practice. And I want juvenile justice personnel not just to attend to the formidable task of creating a level playing field for all kids who enter this system. I want people like yourselves who know the pathway that the Children's Defense Fund has now called the Cradle to Prison Pipeline. I want those of you who see it, because the kids who come to you are passing through it, to use your experience and your positions to lead in our society generally, to in fact dismantle that pipeline once and for all, and to demand equitable treatment throughout the life course for America's most disadvantaged and fragile kids. I want to know that the rights of my kids are guarded at least as zealously as the rights of adults, and hopefully more so. I'm really no longer interested in hearing that because juvenile justice is supposed to be based on the best interests of the child, that my kid doesn't need a lawyer, much less the fierce defender of liberty that a powerless youth ought to have when confronting the vast power of the state. And for those of you who don't think that this is a big problem, you need only look as far as Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, for evidence of the consequences of indifference to this principle. I want a system that's devoted to youth who pose genuine public safety risks, not a system that operates with a huge net, pulling in youth who don't need court interventions and who the research indicates clearly are better off without system intervention. But I want this not simply because I don't want my kids' adolescent behavior to be criminalized, but because I want juvenile justice to be able to succeed with that much smaller number of youth who we now confine in these devilish institutions. We all like to look at the aggregate data from juvenile justice and say, well, we have 2 million arrests, but we only have 400,000 admissions to juvenile detention facilities, and we've only got maybe 80,000 kids in juvenile correction facilities, as we meet here today and say, isn't that a wonderful percentage? Well, I would argue that if you deleted from the denominator all those kids who are coming in via zero-tolerance policies in schools and minor misbehaviors that Senator Whitmire was talking about last evening, those numbers would be far less impressive. Let's get those cases out of the system and devote our resources to the kids who really deserve juvenile justice intervention. Finally, I want juvenile corrections to stop trying to justify itself as a jobs program or an economic development plan. Juvenile justice systems have and should take the lead in demonstrating to the country that justice reinvestment strategies that shift public resources from counterproductive institutions to community-based services can and do work, including demonstrating that the economic dislocations that those opposed to closing these facilities fear can be humanely and fairly managed. I'm sure there are other points that many of you in the audience will add to this list, but I hope that my message is clear. We need more than great policies and procedures. We need to clarify what we hold dear and what we need to demand of ourselves and for our children. JDAI and all the other parts of the growing national movement to safely reduce juvenile confinement provide a unique and powerful context to give life to those ambitions. Let's not miss that opportunity. Let's not fail the kids. Let's not fail the community. I hope you have a great conference, and good luck to all of you.